video is brought to you by the giant pile of laundry on my bed that I need to put away after I'm done filming. Okay, hello, welcome to the video. This is my November wrap-up. If you are new to the channel, welcome. My wrap-ups are always very long. I have been seeing more and more people do mid-month wrap-ups, and I think that's something I need to start doing. Let's talk about all the books I read in November. How many did I read? Hold on. I read 12 books with 1 DNF, and most of them are in physical format, which I'm not going to hold up because I'm just going to drop everything. We'll try that at the end. The first book I finished in November was a reread of Jade City by Fonda. I was hoping to reread the first 2 books in this series for Tome Topple in October. Didn't get to it. I did really want to reread Jade City. Hopefully I'm going to get to my copy of Jade War before the end of the year. We'll see. Thoroughly enjoyed it. How do I talk about this? Okay, first off, on my reread, I made 1 tab. So let's see what is the thing that stood out the most. Oh, this is when Shay is talking to Wen. If you haven't read the book, Shay is the female of the 3 siblings that are at the center of the story, and then Wen is the fiance of one of her brothers, and there's kind of a bit of like, we don't really know each other, like, Wen has kind of been this kind of like background character, and then at some point you start to realize that she's actually this really clever, interesting character that I foresee having a very interesting role in the future. So also, this is a world where you have the Greenbones people with this magic, and Wen is known as a Stone Eye, a person who is born to a family with this magic, but is born with no magic, and they're kind of seen as bad luck, but at the same time they are not necessarily mistreated. It's just kind of like, how disappointing. So with that context, Wen has this conversation with Shay. Expectations are a funny thing, Wen said. When you're born with them, you resent them, fight against them. When you've never been given any, you feel the lack of them your whole life. Wen had finished her tea. She took the bottle of whiskey, poured a straight shot into her cup, and tipped it back. Shay glimpsed in the single swift motion a hidden sharpness to Mike when she realized she did not know the woman at all. And that leads into a very interesting relationship that is started with this book, and I very much look forward to seeing what happens. This is a reread, so I don't want to go on about it too long, but I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to finishing out the rest of the series very soon. Okay, and then pretty much everything else I read was from my TBR hopeful books for November, which were books that were inspired by the Indigathon readathon and the nonfiction November readathon. So I'm just going to talk about the books in the order I read them. So the next book I finished was Betty by Tiffany McDaniel. This is one of the books that has been on my TBR the longest, meaning it's been on my TBR since January. I tend to not let the books I own sit on my physical shelf for very long. And this one I think has sat for a long time because it is like literary historical fiction, which are like 2 genres that don't have a lot of pull for me, so this is not necessarily a book I would have picked up by myself. I'm a never say never kind of person with my reading with genres. Like, just because I have my favorite genres doesn't mean I never read any other genres. So, and this one has gotten really great reviews, really great feedback the whole way, so I was looking forward to seeing it, to just see what people were raving about. And I totally see the hype. So this is it's fiction, but it is heavily inspired by the childhood of the author's mother, who is born to an indigenous father and a white mother. So we follow the character of Betty, who is the character Betty is based on the is based on Tiffany McDaniel's mother's life, at least her early life. Her father is Cherokee, and this mostly takes place rolling foothills of the Appalachians. So we start with how Betty's parents met. So this is a family of like 6 children. There's a couple who don't make it past infancy. Betty is the next to youngest. We're in the middle. And we mostly follow her from like the age of 6 to the age of like 16 or 18. It's been over a month. This is why I need to do mid-month wrap-ups, because I can't remember everything. So it's a story of, I mean, really what this is a love letter to her father, because he imparted a lot of indigenous wisdom onto her, and like it's not even strictly just like indigenous wisdom or Cherokee wisdom, but you can definitely see that he has a lot of love and respect for his heritage, and he uses that as the lens to raise this daughter who he knows is going to have a hard time in the world, because Betty is one of the children who is born with darker skin and darker hair, and she experiences a lot of racism in school because of that. Some of her other siblings are more white passing and thus will be able to navigate through the world very differently. So I think it's definitely a love letter to her father, who really taught her to be proud of her heritage and draw a lot of strength from that in the face of a world who would not really be understanding of that. And it's also, I wouldn't also say a love letter, but like this very heartbreaking but respectful portrait of her mother, who dealt with a lot of mental illness her whole life, and partially maybe her own mental illness, but also like as the product of violence in her past. There is definitely a lot of trigger warnings in this book for, I mean, like I mentioned, racism, sex abuse, child sex abuse. In particular, I want to point out that there is a pretty brutal instance of animal abuse, but well, I've already kind of spoiled it by saying that her mother deals with mental illness, but it is trying to keep it not too spoilery, but also like properly warn you. The animal abuse happens during a mental health crisis, which I think is worth pointing out because I feel like it's a very different kind of horrific than somebody who is committing animal abuse intentionally because they enjoy hurting someone. And I think like as awful as that scene is, it's also very powerful to show how people experiencing a mental health crisis can really just not be aware of the harm that they are causing, or like be aware of it in like a very different, I don't want to say, I guess, strange way, if you don't really understand what's happening. So like the animal abuse thing is definitely a particular scene that stood out to me, but also like it's also a very fascinating scene because of the context in which it happens. Also, we see Betty's very interesting relationship with her siblings, with the town. There's kind of like this weird, like there's like these little interludes of like a newspaper article about like these mysterious gunshots that are heard throughout the town. But yeah, like the writing is very beautiful, at times very poetic. I felt like that flowery poetic language was stronger in the first half of the book, and just like I just didn't notice it as much in the second half of the book. I think like if you like literary fiction, if you like, let's see, and this takes place I think like 60s to early 70s. Again, it's been a month since I read it. So I guess technically it is like historical fiction. Anyway, yes, I definitely see the hype. I definitely see the strength of the author's voice in telling this story. I think you can kind of pick up on that, like, it's not one of my favorite things I've read all month, and I think a lot of that is just it's two genres that are just not my favorite. I don't know, it didn't sink its teeth into me the way that I have encountered with some historical fiction or some literary fiction. I'm very glad to have read it, and if this is something that has seemed interesting to you, I definitely recommend it. Okay, I've only talked about 2 books. Let's move on. The next book I finished was The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. This is a book I read for the nonfiction November prompt of treatment. So this is the story of Henrietta Lacks and her HeLa cells. Henrietta Lacks was a black woman in the 50s who had a very aggressive form of cervical cancer, and when doctors took biopsies of that cancer, they discovered that her cells pretty much were able to replicate indefinitely. They were immortal. This was in the early days of cell culture, and there was a lot of trouble trying to get cells to survive in culture in a laboratory setting and not always having to rely on fresh samples. So the discovery of her cells that had this specific mutation, the specific trait that kind of just allowed them to just keep growing and stay alive, really opened up a lot of doors for scientific research. Problem was, they never got consent really from Henrietta to use her cells for anything beyond her own treatment. Her family didn't really understand about what kind of consent they gave. This is also in the early days of the concept of patient consent and, patient, like, medical confidentialities. So, I think this book does a really good job of showing the history of the complicated ethics that came about from this transition in scientific work, because, like, there's this conception that, like, the people who took her cells made a lot of money. The Johns Hopkins hospital that initially took her cells, they never made money, but lots of people who then had cultures of her cells then did make a lot of money. And to this day, like, the ethics and financial implications of that are still very nebulous. And again, like, I think this book does a really good job of walking you through that history, what has been legal, what hasn't been legal, what are the ethics involved, and how do people tend to fall along those lines. What this book also is a very humanizing story about Henrietta and about her family, and in particular, her youngest daughter, Deborah? Yes, Deborah. And when the author was trying to get in contact with the family to say, like, hey, I'm writing a book about your mother, I'd love to talk to you. The author from the beginning was like, I really want to tell the story of the human being behind these cells. Like, here we are, like, this person has, like, revolutionized, like, cancer treatment and radiation treatment and all of these things, and we know very little about the human being behind the HeLa cells. So that was very much, like, a key part of the author's goal. And when she got in contact with the family, she also tells the story of a lot of trouble that has come on the family because of, like, people wanting to take advantage of them, because of, like, the famousness of her mother's cells, and just, like, the whole saga of the family. And I think the author does a really good job of, like, blending these two sides of the story of, like, the scientific and ethics side of the story, and then also, like, making sure that we get a full picture of the human being and the family, and, like, the implications on human beings from, just, like, the progress of science. I hope I am explaining that well. I partially listened to this on audiobook, and this was narrated by Cassandra Campbell and Bahni Turpin. So yeah, this was really interesting. Really glad we read it. It's a very interesting story, and I liked the audiobook narration. The next book I finished was Firekeeper's Daughter by Angeline Bouley. This was another book that I was inspired to read by Nonfiction November. This is a YA mystery thriller, except I mean, I don't read a lot of mystery thrillers, so I didn't feel like it was thriller-y until really the very end. I didn't feel like things were fast-paced enough and high-stakes enough in the moment for me to call it a thriller until like the last quarter of the book. Angeline Bouley is an enrolled member of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, and that region is like on the Canada, what is that, Minnesota border around the Great Lakes. I don't know that region at all. Sorry, y'all. I need a map. But it is kind of that. It's Great Lakes region. That's what I can give you off the top of my head. So the story of this is this young woman, what is her name? Donis. Her name is Donis. She gets involved in an FBI investigation that is investigating these mysterious murders that have to do with drug trafficking in her community. And due to circumstances, she gets sucked into being a confidential informant and kind of doing some investigation, using her ties to the community to investigate things in a way that an outsider wouldn't have access to. I had so many thoughts. I mean, you can see. I had thoughts. What were they? I remember, I think like up until like the halfway point, I wasn't loving it. Like, I was enjoying it, but I was just kind of like, and then it just kind of grew on me. And by the end of it, like, I found the ending to be very powerful. And this is definitely a portrayal of a lot of issues that impact... Oh, there we go. That's one of the things that I found very interesting in here. There is a lot of discussion in here about being an enrolled member in a tribe, and talking about what's that term, blood quantum, where like depending on like your heritage percentage of like, you know, how many, what percentage Chippewa are you, do you qualify to be an enrolled member, and what does that mean? It's a very complicated issue that, you know, is different between every tribe. But I thought the conversation around that was well portrayed. It was portrayed in an interesting and nuanced way. Like, it shows how complicated it is in a way that doesn't feel too complicated. Like, it just gives you good examples to kind of explain what's going on. So I really liked the conversation in here about that. There's also good conversations about when a tribe has a casino and then takes the earnings from those casinos and pays them out to members of the tribe, and it explains what is that and the impact that has on the community, and how that can be a great thing or a thing that can be abused. Like all things that are man-made, someone out there is going to figure out how to make it shitty, of course. So I really liked this portrayal of some of these issues that, you know, as we learn about, you know, North American Indigenous people and the issues that they have today, like, these are terms and problems that we hear about, but because they're complicated, we often don't, like, hear them thoroughly explored. And I appreciated that the story provided a context to explore some of those things. Oh, also, the elders in here are fucking badass. I just opened to one scene where I'm like, where my tab is basically saying, oh fuck yeah, Minnie. Anyway, which kind of ties into, like, when shit hits the fan, the way this community comes together to, like, figure shit out and get stuff as sorted out as possible, is really exciting. So anyway, yeah, it took me a bit to get into it. Okay, in summary, it took me a bit to get into it. By the end, I really enjoyed it. I absolutely see the hype. If this is something that has been on your radar, it's worth checking out. Like with a lot of stuff I read this month, there's probably a very long list of trigger warnings I could give for this, but I do want to give a specific trigger warning that our protagonist, she does experience sexual assault on page. But I felt like it was done honestly. Like there's like no disguising like what is happening, but it's not it's not very detailed described. It's not drawn out too much why it's included, and the way it kind of like brings the story full circle. Like I absolutely see why that event was in there. The story does explain why that is an event that is important to bring front and center in discussing the various issues that affect current Indigenous tribes today. I hope that makes sense. Okay, something more lighthearted. Yeah, I needed a bit of a lighthearted break, so I picked up an ebook of A Lady of Rooksgrave Manor by Katheryn Moon. This is a smutty monster romance that features a young woman who goes to work at this secluded pleasure house. It is a high class affair, but it caters to clientele who are primarily monsters. And this is they call it a reverse harem because it's a bunch of dudes who are all part of the harem of our one female protagonist. And her harem includes a shapeshifter in the vein of the Hulk kind of dude, or like maybe like Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. I haven't read Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, so I think my brain immediately goes to Bruce Banner and the Hulk. So we've got her Hulk dude, a vampire, a sphinx, a golem, and a man cursed with invisibility. So then the larger plot revolves around there is this sinister immortal character who kind of just wants to wreak destruction and has kind of focused on our protagonist lady as the person he wants to claim for himself. So it's kind of a long story of protecting her, but also figuring out how is he gaining access to the manor and how do we defeat him, or at least defeat him long enough to keep our, core little family safe. But overall, it's very sweet. Of course, it's very smutty. It is. But it's also very sweet. It's very cute and fascinating to see our protagonist navigating all the different personalities of all of her men, because some of them are like more jealous than others, and some of them are more generous than others, and some of them like to play at being jealous, and some of them just kind of butt heads with each other, and she's kind of like, listen, if you give a shit about me, we're a package deal. So you don't get to pick and choose. And also I really love that there was a lot in there, because she has always been a woman of voracious sexual appetite, and this takes place in Victorian times or something, and she's a servant girl, and she's been dismissed many times for her inappropriate behavior, and she's finally very glad to have found an environment where her natural self is actually an asset, and she can find happiness and fulfillment without compromising the things that she actually wants and the things that make her happy, and and also exploring the various forms of intimacy. Like, intimacy is not just sex, it's also like aftercare and socializing and just you know, being cared for in a variety of ways. So it was very sweet. I enjoyed it very much, and I look forward to continuing with the series. I think there's like 3 books in total, maybe. I don't know. Do I know anything? So then the next book I finished was Accessory to War by Neil deGrasse Tyson and Avis Lang, and this is narrated by Courtney B. Vance, which, fun fact, that narrator, he played in the movie adaptation of Henrietta Lacks. Courtney B. Vance, played a significant side character in this movie adaptation. So that was just a cool little, hey, small world overlappingness. So, Accessory to War, the unspoken alliance between astrophysics and the military. So this starts off as each chapter kind of goes over some specific technology that was primarily used in the pursuit of studying the heavens, studying astronomy, and then as technology advanced, studying astrophysics. So, and then discussing how that concept or invention had an impact on the purview of the military, being the purview, or the duties of the military being things like exploration, defense, conquest. You know, for example, calculating accurate timekeeping. You know, just tracking that, like, okay, there's, 365 days in a year, and a day, a month, a lunar cycle lasts about this long, so we can predict when we're going to have the light of the full moon versus a dark moon. We can predict the longest night of the year from the equinox, or the shortest night of the year. And also, like, with zodiac signs and constellations, using that for navigation, the invention of the telescope, the invention of the radio telescope, the invention of radar, etc., etc., etc. As it goes on, it talks more about the politics and ethics and diplomacy of, well, war is good for business in terms of developing industry, in terms of putting lots, having lots of funding to perfect certain things, to investigate certain things. It discusses a lot about, UN treaties and international treaties trying to keep space as a neutral territory. Like, space is not, there's a lot of international discussion about space needs to be this non-militarized zone. And, the loopholes in the language that governs that. Space should be a protected area for the pursuit of knowledge, but also, satellites have a lot of military application. There's a lot of really interesting ideas in here, but this was ultimately just a disappointing 3-star read for me, because especially in the first part, where we're talking about more ancient, pre-industrial revolution, what's pre-turn to this, pre-industrialization, that's what I want to say. Early 1900s industrialization. There's just way too much detail. I saw a comment where somebody said, this could also be named Astrophysics for People Who Are Not in a Hurry, which Neil deGrasse Tyson has written this tiny little book called Astrophysics for People in a Hurry. And this book, for example, when it's talking about, crafting the glass for telescopes, it's talking about light spectrum and, the various chemical compositions of the various minerals used in the glass. And it's it's cool to see all of the science that goes into it, but that's not what I thought this book was about. So it just made all of that exploration seem really bloated. You didn't need to tell me everything in order to tell me about this relationship. Anyway, there could have been a more concise discussion about what the title led me to believe this book was about. And I was left wanting. So the next book I read, this was another book I picked up for Indigathon. This is The Bone People by Keri Hulme. Keri Hulme is a New Zealand author of Maori heritage, right? Yes, part Maori, part European. And this is a literary fiction memoir. Let's see, winner of the 1985 Booker Prize, and also, what was the other thing? The Pegasus Prize for Literature. So this is a literary fiction that follows an eccentric artistic woman who lives in a tower by the sea, and they kind of explain how she came into some money, so she's allowed to be like the resident artistic eccentric of the town. And then she befriends this nonverbal boy named Simon, who and he's a white boy with like Scandinavian white blonde hair. And through circumstances that we learn about, he gets adopted by this Maori family, and then the wife dies, and so this like neurodivergent mute boy is raised by this Maori father. Things are gonna look, oh man, this looks way brighter. Okay, things are gonna look different because my other camera just completely died on me. Hopefully I didn't miss too much. So there's the woman, the nonverbal boy, and his father. And his father is dealing with a lot of grief from losing his wife, and is an alcoholic. And it is beautifully written. I love our protagonist. Well, they're all kind of protagonists, but I love Katheryn, who is the eccentric artist woman. I think she's a really interesting, badass, cranky character. I mean, she's kind of like every story, like think of like the trope of like the grumpy curmudgeon-y old man who then befriends this like manic pixie dream girl kind of scenario. So but it's kind of like that, but she's this like 30-year-old eccentric woman. And then instead of a manic pixie dream girl, we have this mysterious, intelligent, neurodivergent boy. They never use the word autistic, and they never use the word neurodivergent. I mean, this book's written in the 80s, but they make it very clear that like he can hear just fine. He understands the concept of he understands language just fine. He can write. He can communicate very well. And what's beautiful about like the relationship between the boy Simon and Katheryn is what stands out to him is she listens to him, in the sense of, okay, she picks up on he doesn't talk. She makes the effort. She doesn't lose her patience in trying to understand him. She knows that, okay, you're intelligent. You can either gesture, or you can write, or you can point at things. Like, you can communicate. I just need to figure out, how are you communicating? And then she talks to him like he's a normal person. Like a normal hearing person. She doesn't like raise her voice or do baby talk or, whatever. She doesn't treat him like an idiot, because he's not. So that relationship is very interesting from the beginning. And then they kind of become this like weird family unit, because being neurodivergent in a time and place that doesn't really accommodate that, in the sense that like you're either treated like a complete invalid, or you're expected to behave normally, and there's not a lot in between. So Simon has been acting out a lot. He runs away, he gets into fights at school, and we definitely explore like a lot of the context behind that. And a lot of the context is his father, what's his father's name? Joe. Because Joe is an alcoholic and is dealing with a lot of things, when he goes on an alcoholic bender, he is very physically abusive to Simon. But it's a very fascinating look at how somebody who like loves their child can also be abusive to them. Like, there's a lot of discussion in here about like Carolyn has this moment of knowing that like she's witnessing a crime. She should call Child Protective Services. But she also knows that probably the worst thing to happen to Simon, that could happen to Simon, is for him to be taken away from his father. Because his father does, maybe not quite to the extent that Carolyn does, but does understand him, does understand that like he's not stupid, he's not an imbecile, is trying to raise him as best as possible. And they both understand that if Simon gets thrown into the foster care, the foster care system, he's never going to actually get the kind of care that he needs. This is an issue with like foster care in all over the world to this day. Is like, it's a system that's not really built to accommodate the needs of disabled and neurodivergent children. So the crux of the story is that Carolyn makes a decision she's like, I can't report it. I don't feel good about that. I can't do nothing. So fuck, I have to choose to be involved. Fuck. And that's not really what she wants to do, but she knows that in this circumstance it's the right thing to do. So it is this beautiful, intricate, artistic, heartbreaking story of this kind of puzzle pieced found family, and them trying to navigate the problems within this family. And I really, really liked it until the ending. I did not like the ending. And I very rarely feel so strongly about how something ends. But basically, things happen. The abuse comes to a head, and the perspectives get split into Simon. And actually, Simon's perspective I actually really liked. But then the final chapter with Joe, and then the final chapter with Carolyn do these things that I didn't fucking like. I felt, and okay, I'll get into it. So the final chapter with Joe, he ends up finding this old Maori man who may or may not be real. And there is this very, very spiritual, very dreamlike, very mythic conversation and series of events that it's not that I had a problem with like this kind of like traditional spirituality coming into the story, but it was completely different from any representation of spirituality that the rest of the book had had. It was too different. That's my problem with it, is suddenly now a character is going on this massive spiritual journey and taking on this like huge spiritual ancient heritage responsibility, and that is just not the tone of the rest of the story. These characters' relationship to their heritage and the lasting power of their heritage has not been navigated in this way, throughout, the 80% of the book leading up to it. So it just, I couldn't get into it. And so that was one part of it. And then in Carolyn's split perspective, there is this whole Deus Ex Machina miraculous solving of this problem that also just felt like that's not what this whole book set me up to expect. And then like things end too happy. It doesn't feel like it fits that things wrapped up as neatly as they did. And so I think a lot of what I didn't like is a lot of personal preference, but it has been a long time since I have disliked an ending to a book as viscerally as I reacted to when I closed the end of the book. Like I turned the last page and I was just like, what the fuck? Overall, I did really enjoy it. I am really glad to read it. And this is like a literary fiction book that I did really enjoy. I did really, really gel with most of this writing style. So I can enjoy literary fiction. It's possible. So after that, I took another little lighthearted break, and I picked up Morning Glory Milking Farm by C.M. Nacosta. I think this book has like been really popular on TikTok or something. I don't have a TikTok or a Twitter, but I heard about it. I heard about it through Books Like Whoa. I saw that she had read this, and I'm like, what is that? And looked up the synopsis, and then like listened to her review, and I'm like, actually, that does sound fun and sweet, and again, like a total palate cleanser to reading books that deal with a lot of heavy topics. So I picked it up. The premise is this young woman has graduated. This is definitely a inspired by millennials in an economic depression scenario where a young woman has graduated college and is having a really hard time finding a decent wage job in her field, and she comes across this job posting to work in this factory acquiring certain fluids from minotaurs to be used as an ingredient in pharmaceuticals. The book does a pretty good job of like making the argument that like, this is not sex work, at least not in the way that you think it is, even though you are dealing with sexual organs and interactions that traditionally are of a sexual nature. But the environment is very professional, the workers are taken care of, there's a lot of safety standards in place, there's a lot of training in place, and the wages are fucking good. And I think there's a lot of commentary in there about like, even though like they make the case that like this really isn't sex work, this is more like pharmaceutical medical work, and it has like that kind of professionalism. I think there is also a conversation to be had about like, okay, but what if sex work could be performed in a scenario where the workers are trained and taken care of and protected and paid well? Because there's a lot of conversation in here about like the amazing stress relief and financial freedom of having a decent job and finally being able to make the choices you want rather than like the choices you just need to struggle and survive. And also that like, so there's that conversation, but also like, hey, when you treat your workers well, the process is good for everyone on all sides of it. Hint, hint, capitalism. And I think somewhere in there, like I had this thought of, there is this disability justice activist called Andrew Gurza, who he does a lot of advocating for disabled people being able to express their sexuality, and also like addressing the issue that disabled people crave intimacy, they crave physical touch, they crave sexual experiences, they crave they have needs. And because of their disability, it is often very difficult for them to satisfy those needs in a safe and satisfactory manner. And he has made this comment about how he is totally in favor of disability payment. What is that called? Disability economic relief or whatever. Being able to go towards hiring sex workers for companionship because, intimacy and sexual touch and sexual release is a need for some people more than others, but like it's as much a need as, safe shelter and good food and healthcare and education. Like, intimacy is also a human need. So why do we look down on the industry that brings that to people who have challenges to finding these relationships organically? So this book just kind of made me think about that conversation a lot. Like, even though this, company is trying to like make things not sexual, like there's also this conversation about, I guess, kind of questioning the assumption that like all sex work is kind of like seedy and gross and shameful, and that there is this way for people to meet their needs in a way that is safe and respectable and whatever other word you want to throw at it. So anyway, it was interesting that it made me think about this whole other conversation. And I don't really think that like that is a conversation that was in mind when this person wrote this story, but I just think it's interesting that like this smutty monster book made me think about this whole conversation about disability justice and intimacy and sex work. Anyway, but overall, the story is very sweet. The relationship is quite sweet, and I really liked this little world that the author has written, and this is another series I would like to read more in because I liked the world that this author built. The next book I finished was this graphic novel, This Place, 150 Years Retold. This is a graphic novel anthology that features quite a few Indigenous writers and artists and illustrators, and it kind of reviews some major events, particularly in Canada, of Indigenous history. Let's see, so let me go through the authors. So the foreword is by Alicia Elliott. I know her as the author of A Mind Spread Out on the Ground, which is a memoir I read last year and really enjoyed. Stories are also by, I have not rehearsed these names. Bear with me. I'm going to list the names on the screen as I say them, so that if I completely butcher the pronunciation of it, you will have a correct spelling to refer to. Stories by Kateri Akiwenzi Dam, Sani Asu, Brandon Mitchell, Rachel and Sean Quetzalik Tinsley, David A. Robertson, Nigan Wewidam, James Sinclair, Jen Storm, Richard Van Camp, Katarina Vermette, and Chelsea Vowell. Illustration and colors by Tara Audibert, Kyle Charles, GMB Chomichuk, Natasha Donovan, Scott A. Ford, Scott B. Henderson, Ryan Howe, Andrew Lodwick, Jen Storm, and Donovan Yaciuk. So I really like the format of this because at the beginning of each story there is this little blurb from the writer that kind of talks about the historical person or event or idea, and then there is a timeline that kind of gives you some historical context to, various laws and events that correspond to this event. And actually, from the very first story, there was something that kind of really shook up my assumptions about Native American history. This takes place in Red River, in what is now Winnipeg's Exchange District. This is a Métis community. And this takes place in 1850, and the people in this community, they're wearing mostly like Western clothes. Their homes have, architecture similar to the European settlers in the region, and that is not something I have ever seen before. Like, when I think about the history I learned in school about, Native Americans in North America, it's kind of like, First Contact, Thanksgiving, Trail of Tears, and there's not a lot in between. This first story already made me think about, there was a period of time between First Contact and really accelerated attempted genocide. There was a period of time where there was some, exchange and adoption of the cultures of the European settlers and the native people, and that is not something I have ever seen depicted before. And I'm sure it varies from region to region how much that happened before there was, full on military pushing away of indigenous people. It just never occurred to me that there was a period of time where, who said that indigenous communities never adopted European fashion or, adopted, certain architectural techniques or farming techniques or whatever. So already from story one, this really challenges what history I have been taught and what kind of images I have seen of indigenous people. There's definitely a very particular narrative that has been present in all the history books I've ever seen. So that's just to give you a taste of the kind of stuff that's in here. I think my favorite art style in here, is this art style. And this is a story that talks about Inuit mythology and Inuit contact with settlers in that region. And also distinguishing that the Inuit culture is very distinct from the other indigenous communities that might be present in southern Alaska and Canada. So this story was probably my favorite because it was kind of made my brain stretch the most. And it comes all the way up to present day. It talks about Standing Rock, and it talks about the way that indigenous fishing rights have been challenged, the way that their forestry rights have been challenged, Standing Rock and the oil pipelines. So this was really cool. I would love to see this in schools as a supplement to a lot of other social studies and US history education. Oh, you know what this reminded me of? It reminded me of 400 Souls, what's the subtitle? A community history of African Americans, of African America, of Black America. Not that there was a lot of overlap of style. Clearly this is very different, but both of them are kind of they're not necessarily a full linear history, but both of them are a filling in the gaps of the history that you have been told, what has been left out of that. And then also a conglomeration of a lot of talent of the communities being talked about, because 400 Souls, every essay is written by a different prominent Black writer, and then the audiobook, each one of those stories is narrated by a different prominent Black vocal talent. So in culmination, the amount of Black American talent in that project is amazing, and I think there is a similar thing going on here with the writers and the illustrators. So yeah, this is really cool. Hurrah. And then quickly, I'm going to talk about my one DNF and then the last book. So my one DNF was the memoir Blonde Indian by Ernestine Hayes. I got about 30% of the way into this, I believe. No, I got about 50% of the way into this. And I just wasn't getting along with the writing style. The memoir part of it was kind of the memoir style that I don't love, where it's very focused on this one person. At times the writing tried to be very descriptive and flowery, and then other times I was really bored by it. And then interspersed, the author will then describe some native mythology tales, native folklore that she grew up hearing, but they're not integrated very well. So it's she talks about her life, And then there's a section where she's here's this myth. And then she's also talking about the history of this other person. And I don't know who this other person is and what relationship he has to our author. And then our author also like really talks about her childhood in detail. And then basically in like 2 paragraphs talks about her super traumatic like early 20s and now coming back to her community in her 40s. And like I totally understand not wanting to really get into a lot of details of your trauma and just kind of say that like here's what the trauma was. Now let's talk about how I was dealing with it and how like reconnecting with my roots was like very instrumental in that. But it just felt weird to skip this very formative, like 2 decades of her life. So anyway, I put it down just to like give it a break, and I didn't have any desire to pick it back up. So I'm like, you know what? They can't all be winners. Too many books, so little time. I'm going to try not to stress too much about not finishing it. Okay, so speaking of memoirs I loved, the last book I finished was In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. And I also listened to this on audiobook, and that was narrated by the author. This might be one of my favorite books I've read all year. It's definitely like a contender for one of my favorite nonfiction of the. So this I read for the nonfiction November prompt of style, because this is a memoir written in a very interesting style. So this is specifically a memoir of the author's experience of being in an emotionally abusive relationship, but also it is a queer relationship. So she's talking a lot about how, physical abuse, how domestic abuse is not a very visible thing in queer communities, specifically in sapphic relationships and lesbian relationships. And then also the fact that like her abuse was emotional abuse and gaslighting. So it's not like she could show people the bruises. Like it was very, very hard for her to even realize like what she was going through was abuse, and like that added layer of invisibility. So then the format is, she talks about the dream house being like this house where she and her, like, I don't think they ever lived together full time, but there was like the house of her partner, and how, she's kind of using this metaphor of this house, of this haunted house. Maybe there's a little bit of like mind palace concept going on as she's like reviewing her, talking about her relationship. So each chapter is dream house as accident, dream house as ambition, dream house as hypochondria, dream house as choose your own adventure. And she's kind of using that like descriptor to view one facet of this relationship. And she's also, this book really made me think of Disfigured by Andrea Leduc, which talks about the intersection of like folk tales and fairy tales and disability, and there's a lot of heavy literary analysis, and this one also has that. There's a lot of footnotes. Let's see. And she's constantly referring to the motif index of folk literature of all of these like archetypal characters or plot lines, and how that is like reflected in this like this ghost story, this haunted story of her relationship. So there's things like, the ghost calls, the ghost moans, the ghost cries and screams, the concept of the liar, I have no time to lie today, taboo, asking for reason of an unusual action. And I don't know if I am making any sense, but like it is this fascinating mix of like literary analysis, haunted house, beautiful literary writing, memoir of domestic abuse, memoir of queer relationship, memoir of the process of writing about your past and your trauma. There's a lot of facets to this, and somehow Nothing feels too much. Everything flows really beautifully. I think anyone who has ever been in a troubled relationship, like not even necessarily an abusive relationship, but anyone who has ever been in any kind of, who has ever had any kind of relationship problems, I feel like you're going to see yourself at some point in this story. And it's, in terms of like, just the weird surreal feeling of, you know, hindsight being 2020. You look back on it and you're like, why did I stay? Why didn't I say this? Why didn't I say that? Again, like, I'm probably not really talking about this really coherently. We're not going to worry about it. It's excellent. Many other people have said so, and here I am wholeheartedly agreeing with them. This is definitely something I can see myself rereading, which I think is kind of surprising given the, like, subject matter. But I'm like, it's not like I want to reread it soon, but I absolutely look forward to coming back to this writing experience in the future. The writing is just so exquisite. We made it. Great. Okay. If you have made it to the end of the video, you are a trooper. If you've made it this far, can you leave me a flame emoji in honor of Firekeeper's Daughter? Or if you want to discuss if you have read any of these books recently, if they're on your TBR, what thoughts do you have? Great. Anyway, so I hope you have a good rest of your day. I encourage you to go out into the world and be curious. I will have my social media and other places where you can find me in the description box below. And I will chat with you folks. What's my outro? Shit. And I will catch you folks in my next video. Bye!